What comes to mind when you think of Vikings? For many, it's an image of towering, blond-haired warriors with piercing blue eyes, sailing their dragon-headed ships across rough seas. But what if I told you that this popular stereotype is more myth than fact? What if Vikings weren't the genetically pure, homogeneous group we've imagined for centuries? Recent breakthroughs in DNA research have turned our understanding of the Viking Age upside down. Scientists have discovered that these legendary seafarers were far more diverse than we ever thought, with ancestry that stretched beyond Scandinavia to include southern Europe, Western Asia, and even the British Isles. And here's the real twist. Many Vikings didn't even fit the traditional image of light-haired, blue-eyed Norsemen. So, why does Viking DNA continue to fascinate historians, scientists, and even the general public? Perhaps it's because these genetic revelations force us to reconsider everything we thought we knew about the Vikings, where they came from, how they lived, and how they shaped the world we live in today. In this video, we'll unravel the mysteries hidden in Viking DNA. From groundbreaking research that mapped the genomes of hundreds of Viking remains to surprising insights into their migration patterns, physical traits, and cultural identity, we'll explore why historians find themselves captivated by Viking genetics. But more than that, we'll show how these discoveries connect us to an age of exploration, resilience, and global interaction. The Vikings were more than just fierce warriors. They were a civilization of explorers, traders, and settlers who left an indelible mark on history. Originating from the Scandinavian countries of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, the Vikings flourished during the Viking Age, spanning from roughly 750 to 1050 CE. But their influence extended far beyond their homeland. These maritime adventurers were masters of the sea, traveling vast distances in their iconic longships. They raided monasteries, looted treasures, and instilled fear in coastal communities across Europe. Yet, the Vikings were not only raiders, they were also skilled craftsmen, traders, and settlers who helped establish trade networks stretching from the Mediterranean to Asia. Their expeditions took them to North America, long before Columbus, and as far east as Russia and the Middle East. Along the way, they exchanged goods, technology, and ideas, forever shaping the cultures they encountered. They founded settlements in Ireland, Greenland, and Iceland, and even left their genetic mark on the populations of these regions. However, what often gets overlooked is their dual legacy. While stories of pillaging dominate popular narratives, Vikings also played a significant role in advancing trade, art, and innovation. For example, their craftsmanship in jewelry and metalwork was renowned across Europe. They were also adept at adapting to new environments, forming alliances, and integrating with local cultures. Understanding who the Vikings were requires seeing them not as a monolithic group, but as a dynamic civilization whose identity evolved as they traveled, mixed, and adapted. And this is where the study of Viking DNA becomes so important. It provides an unprecedented glimpse into the diversity and complexity of this remarkable people. By examining their genetic legacy, historians are uncovering not just where the Vikings went, but who they were at their core, a civilization far more complex and interconnected than we ever imagined. For centuries, much of what we believed about the Vikings came from sagas, historical records, and archaeology. But these sources could only tell part of the story. They described the Viking raids, their settlements, and even their legendary feats, but they couldn't reveal the deeper questions. Where exactly did they come from? Who were they genetically? And how did their voyages shape the populations of Europe and beyond? That's where DNA analysis changed everything. Recent breakthroughs in genetics have given historians and scientists a powerful tool to peer into the past. By extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from Viking remains, researchers have unlocked secrets that were buried for over 1,000 years. One groundbreaking study, published in Nature, analyzed the genomes of 442 individuals from Viking-era archaeological sites across Europe and Greenland. Using advanced techniques, scientists sequenced DNA from teeth and petrous bones, which are excellent at preserving genetic material over time. These findings were then compared to thousands of modern genomes, creating one of the most comprehensive genetic maps of the Viking Age. Another study, published in Cell, delved even deeper, examining nearly 300 ancient genomes spanning 2,000 years of Scandinavian history. This research not only revealed patterns of migration and gene flow but also painted a vivid picture of how Viking ancestry transformed over time. But why does DNA matter so much in understanding the Vikings? Because it provides an unbiased, scientific lens to explore their lives. For instance, the sagas often portrayed the Vikings as a homogeneous group of Scandinavian warriors. DNA evidence, however, tells a different story. It reveals a people who were genetically diverse, with ancestry from as far as southern Europe and Western Asia. What's more, DNA analysis has illuminated the Vikings' migration patterns and their far-reaching influence. By mapping genetic signatures, scientists can now trace the paths of Viking expeditions with remarkable accuracy. It's through this lens that we've come to understand how Danish Vikings primarily raided England, Norwegian Vikings journeyed to Ireland and Greenland, and Swedish Vikings ventured into the Baltics and Ukraine. These genetic studies also offer a new way to connect cultural and archaeological discoveries. For example, in Sam, Estonia, researchers unearthed a Viking ship burial containing the remains of 41 individuals. DNA revealed that 4 of them were brothers, suggesting that family ties played a significant role in Viking expeditions, something traditional records never mentioned. By transforming how we study history, DNA analysis is bridging the gaps left by written and archaeological sources. It's not just reshaping what we know about the Vikings, it's redefining how we understand their place in the broader tapestry of human history. One of the most surprising revelations from Viking DNA research is just how genetically diverse the Vikings were. For centuries, they were thought to be a homogeneous group, an isolated population of blond-haired, blue-eyed Scandinavians. However, DNA analysis has completely overturned this idea, showing that the Vikings were far more diverse than previously imagined. Dark hair and eyes were more common among Vikings than modern Scandinavians, which immediately challenges the stereotypical image. This diversity was the result of gene flow from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and even Western Asia, as people from these regions migrated into Scandinavia over time. Southern Europe played a particularly important role in this story. DNA extracted from Viking remains in southern Scandinavia reveals genetic markers typical of Mediterranean populations. These genes likely came from traders or settlers who arrived in Scandinavia centuries before the Viking Age, and their influence persisted as the Vikings emerged as a dominant cultural force. Similarly, Eastern European and Asian ancestry entered Scandinavia through trade routes and migrations, contributing further to the genetic complexity of Viking populations. This influx of new genes didn't just add diversity. It gave the Vikings access to a broader range of traits that may have helped them adapt to different environments and thrive as seafarers. The genetic diversity of the Vikings was also shaped by their own expeditions. Danish Vikings primarily raided and settled in England, leaving a significant genetic legacy that can still be traced in modern British populations. Norwegian Vikings traveled west to Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland, where they left an enduring genetic imprint. Meanwhile, Swedish Vikings ventured east to the Baltic region and as far as Ukraine and Russia, spreading their genetic influence across Eastern Europe. Each group of Vikings carried its own distinct genetic makeup, creating a patchwork of ancestry that reflected their migrations and interactions with the people they encountered along the way. Even within Scandinavia, genetic diversity was uneven. Southern Scandinavia was a hotspot for genetic mixing, as it was more open to migration and trade, while inland areas like central Sweden remained isolated and retained older genetic traits. This stark contrast highlights how geography shaped the genetic and cultural evolution of Viking populations. Ultimately, Viking DNA reveals a much more complex and interconnected world than we once thought. Rather than being a genetically pure group, the Vikings were a mosaic of ancestries, shaped by centuries of migration, trade, and exploration. This diversity not only challenges traditional views but also highlights how interconnected the ancient world truly was. Viking DNA tells a story of adaptation and evolution, reminding us that history is far richer and more intricate than the myths we've been told. The study of Viking DNA has provided historians and scientists with some remarkable insights into their ancestry, culture, and migrations. Perhaps one of the most eye-opening findings is how much the Vikings' physical traits differed from popular stereotypes. While we often imagine Vikings as universally blonde and blue-eyed, DNA analysis has shown that many had dark hair and brown eyes. This wasn't a rare exception but a reflection of the genetic diversity within Viking populations, influenced by centuries of migration and intermingling with other groups. In fact, modern Scandinavians are more likely to be blonde than their Viking ancestors. Another fascinating discovery comes from the Viking burial sites themselves. At Sarm in Estonia, a ship burial revealed the remains of 41 Viking warriors who died during a failed raid. DNA testing showed that these men were closely related, with 4 of them identified as brothers. This surprising find suggests that some Viking expeditions were family affairs, with raiding parties composed of close-knit groups rather than randomly assembled crews. It also paints a more personal picture of Viking life, showing how family ties played a role in their dangerous ventures. The genetic legacy of the Vikings extends far beyond Scandinavia. In England, for example, up to 6% of the population carries Viking DNA, a result of the extensive settlement of Danish Vikings during the 9th and 10th centuries. In modern Scandinavia, around 10% of people still have genetic markers that trace back to the Viking Age. These findings highlight how deeply the Vikings influenced the populations they encountered and how their legacy has endured through the centuries. What's even more intriguing is that not all individuals identified as Vikings were genetically Scandinavian. In Scotland's Orkney Islands, for example, researchers found Viking-style burials that contained individuals with genetic markers linked to the local Pictish population. This indicates that some people adopted Viking customs and culture, even if they weren't of Viking ancestry. It also reinforces the idea that Viking identity was more about lifestyle and culture than purely genetics. These key findings demonstrate that the Vikings were not a monolithic group but a diverse and dynamic civilization. Their genetic traces connect them to a wide range of regions and cultures, challenging the narrow narratives that have persisted for centuries. By analyzing their DNA, we're able to uncover new layers of history and gain a deeper understanding of how the Vikings influenced and were influenced by the world around them. The fascination with Viking DNA isn't limited to historians and scientists. It has captured the curiosity of people around the world who are eager to uncover their own connections to this legendary era. With the rise of commercial ancestry tests, millions of people are now exploring their genetic heritage, and many are discovering traces of Scandinavian ancestry that link them to the Viking Age. These modern DNA tests have made it possible for anyone to take a closer look at their roots, often revealing surprising connections to the past. One of the most intriguing findings is the extent of Viking genetic influence across modern populations. In the United Kingdom, studies suggest that up to 6% of the population carries Viking DNA, a legacy of centuries of settlement by Danish and Norwegian Vikings. In Scandinavia itself, around 10% of people are believed to have direct genetic links to their Viking ancestors. This genetic legacy isn't confined to Europe. Thanks to the Vikings' far-reaching travels, traces of their DNA can be found in regions as distant as Greenland and even North America. The popularity of ancestry testing has grown alongside these discoveries. Companies like Ancestry DNA and Ancestry offer people the chance to analyze their DNA and compare it to ancient Viking genomes. These tests can reveal not only the presence of Scandinavian ancestry but also which Viking groups, Danish, Norwegian, or Swedish, you might be most closely connected to. This personalized approach to understanding history has sparked a global interest in Viking heritage, turning what was once a distant historical topic into something deeply personal. However, it's important to understand the limitations of these tests. While they can identify regions of ancestry, they can't definitively confirm Viking lineage. The genetic markers found in modern populations often overlap with other European groups, making it difficult to draw direct connections to the Viking Age. That said, these tests offer an incredible opportunity to explore broader patterns of migration and settlement, shedding light on how interconnected the ancient world truly was. This renewed interest in Viking DNA has also inspired efforts to preserve and celebrate Viking history in Scandinavia and beyond. Viking festivals, reenactments, and museums dedicated to their culture are more popular than ever, drawing visitors from around the world. In many ways, the study of Viking DNA has reignited a cultural connection to this fascinating era, helping people to better understand their shared history while embracing the global impact of the Vikings. Ultimately, the modern fascination with Viking DNA is about more than just ancestry. It's a window into the past that helps us see how deeply connected we are to the people who came before us. By exploring these genetic links, we're not only uncovering ancient stories but also gaining a deeper appreciation for the legacy of the Vikings and their enduring influence on the world we live in today. When most people think of Vikings, they envision tall, blond-haired, blue-eyed warriors who represented a genetically pure Scandinavian race. But DNA research has revealed that many of these ideas are simply myths, created over centuries of storytelling and romanticization. Let's set the record straight about some of the most common misconceptions surrounding Viking ancestry. The first myth to tackle is the notion that all Vikings were Scandinavian. While the Viking Age began in Scandinavia, genetic evidence shows that many individuals who adopted Viking culture were not of Scandinavian descent at all. For instance, in the Orkney Islands of Scotland, Viking-style burials have been found containing individuals with genetic markers linked to the local Pictish population. These findings suggest that Viking identity wasn't purely based on ancestry, but was more of a cultural affiliation. People across Europe embraced the Viking way of life, adopting their customs, beliefs, and even burial practices, regardless of their genetic background. Another widespread myth is that Vikings all had blonde hair and blue eyes. While these traits were certainly present, they weren't as universal as many believe. DNA studies have shown that dark hair and brown eyes were common among Viking populations, particularly due to the genetic diversity brought by migrations from southern Europe, Western Asia, and the British Isles. In fact, modern Scandinavians are more likely to have blonde hair than their Viking ancestors, a testament to how populations have evolved over time. One of the most persistent myths is the idea of a distinct Viking gene that can be easily identified through DNA testing. The truth is, there is no single genetic marker that confirms Viking ancestry. Instead, what DNA tests can reveal is Scandinavian ancestry, which might overlap with regions historically inhabited by Vikings. This means that having Scandinavian roots doesn't necessarily prove a direct connection to the Vikings. It simply suggests that your ancestors may have lived in or near Viking-populated areas. Finally, there's a myth about Viking physical appearance being uniform and easily recognizable. In reality, the genetic diversity of Viking populations meant that their appearances varied widely. From fair skin to olive tones, light eyes to dark, the Vikings were far more diverse than popular culture would have us believe. Their genetic makeup was influenced by centuries of migration and intermarriage with people from across Europe and Asia, creating a mosaic of traits that defies simple categorization. Debunking these myths is essential not just for historical accuracy but also to counter the ways Viking imagery has been misused in modern times. Some extremist groups have co-opted the idea of a pure Viking race to promote racist and nationalist ideologies. But the scientific evidence is clear. Vikings were not a homogeneous group, and their identity was shaped by cultural exchange and diversity. By understanding the truth about Viking ancestry, we can move beyond stereotypes and appreciate the Vikings for who they really were, a dynamic, interconnected civilization that left a lasting impact on the world. These revelations remind us that history is far more complex and fascinating than the myths we create around it. The study of Viking DNA has not only deepened our understanding of history but has also raised important ethical and cultural questions. As we uncover the complexities of Viking ancestry, it's crucial to consider how this knowledge is used and interpreted, particularly in a world where history can sometimes be distorted for political or ideological purposes. One of the most pressing concerns is the misuse of Viking history and imagery to promote ideas of racial purity and nationalism. For decades, extremist groups have romanticized the Vikings as a symbol of a so-called pure Nordic race. This myth, now thoroughly debunked by DNA research, has been weaponized to justify exclusionary or racist ideologies. But the truth revealed by Viking DNA tells a very different story, one of diversity, cultural exchange, and interconnectedness. Far from being isolated or homogeneous, the Vikings embraced new people, ideas, and genetic influences, reflecting a globalized world even in ancient times. Another ethical challenge lies in the commercialization of ancestry tests and how they frame Viking heritage. While these tests can be an exciting way for individuals to explore their roots, they sometimes oversimplify or exaggerate connections to the Vikings. For instance, marketing materials often emphasize the allure of having Viking blood, which can perpetuate inaccurate ideas about what Viking ancestry truly means. It's important to recognize that genetic testing doesn't provide a definitive Viking label but rather highlights broader patterns of migration and heritage. The findings about Viking diversity also challenge us to rethink how we view cultural identity. The revelation that some individuals buried in Viking-style graves had no Scandinavian genetic markers shows that Viking culture was not exclusive. It was a lifestyle and a shared identity that transcended genetics, inviting participation from people of diverse backgrounds. This perspective pushes us to see history not as a story of isolated groups but as a dynamic process shaped by interaction and exchange. Finally, there's the question of representation and education. How do we ensure that the true story of the Vikings reaches a wide audience and isn't overshadowed by myths or misinterpretations? Museums, educators, and media creators have a responsibility to present accurate, nuanced narratives that celebrate the Vikings' contributions while acknowledging their complexities. By doing so, we can foster a deeper appreciation for history and its relevance to our interconnected world today. Viking DNA research has taught us that history is rarely as simple as we imagine. It challenges stereotypes, dispels myths, and reminds us that diversity and adaptability are at the heart of human progress. As we continue to learn from the past, we must also use this knowledge responsibly, ensuring it brings people together rather than dividing them. The Vikings, with all their complexity and global connections, offer us a powerful example of how cultures can thrive through openness and exchange. The fascination with Viking DNA isn't just about discovering the unexpected. It's about rewriting history in ways that bring us closer to understanding the people who shaped the world as we know it. For historians, scientists, and anyone curious about the past, Viking DNA offers a window into a complex and interconnected era that challenges long-standing assumptions and inspires fresh perspectives. One of the reasons historians remain captivated by Viking DNA is how it reveals the true extent of the Vikings' global impact. These were people who traveled farther and connected with more cultures than almost anyone else of their time. By analyzing their DNA, we can trace their movements with remarkable precision, from the coasts of England to the far reaches of Greenland, from the shores of the Baltic to the vast expanse of the Mediterranean. Viking DNA doesn't just tell us where they went, it shows us how deeply they engaged with the people they encountered. Another reason Viking DNA fascinates historians is its ability to bring forgotten stories to light. For example, the discovery of Viking burial sites containing individuals with no Scandinavian genetic markers reveals how inclusive Viking culture could be. These were people who adopted Viking traditions, traveled with Viking expeditions, and lived by Viking customs despite having entirely different genetic backgrounds. It's a powerful reminder that history is shaped by individuals and their choices, not just by the broad strokes of geography or genetics. The insights from Viking DNA also help us better understand the diversity of human experience. The Vikings were not a monolithic group, and their genetic makeup reflects centuries of migration, trade, and adaptation. This complexity reminds us that no culture or civilization exists in isolation. Every society is a product of its interactions with others. Viking DNA underscores the richness of these connections, showing us how the blending of cultures and peoples can lead to innovation and progress. Finally, Viking DNA captivates historians because it connects us to our own stories. For many people today, ancestry tests and genetic research offer a personal link to history, turning abstract concepts into something tangible. Whether you have Scandinavian roots or not, the Viking story is part of a larger human narrative, one of exploration, resilience, and the enduring power of curiosity. As we look to the future, the study of Viking DNA continues to evolve, promising new discoveries that could reshape our understanding of this iconic civilization. What else might we uncover about the Vikings and their legacy? How might these insights inform the way we see our own history and our place in the world? Viking DNA is more than just a scientific curiosity. It's a bridge to the past, connecting us to a civilization that thrived on exploration and diversity. It challenges us to think beyond stereotypes and embrace the complexity of human history. In doing so, it reminds us that the most captivating stories are often the ones we didn't expect to find.